Okay, let's go to work. You'll recall that Ouranos, sky, is a real bad king of the gods, right? Yeah, he persistently rapes Earth, Gaia, Earth, won't let the children be born. He doesn't want to be his power usurped by his children, right? That is, he knows that if anybody else is born, that he might lose power. Earth gets enough of this, the children get enough of this, and they whack it off, and he is no longer king of the gods. Kronos is. He swallows all his children, same reason, second verse, same as the first. But of course, ultimately, Zeus comes along and with a little help from his friends manages to overthrow Kronos, right? And now Zeus is king. I believe that Hesiod's story of Ouranos, Kronos, and Zeus is true. Assuming, as I did, that most of you would say no, the previous two kings of the gods had wanted to secure power and hold on to it permanently. Those actions are perceived as unjust, right? Zeus is going to maintain his power by being wise enough not to commit the injustices in the first place. Act justly, and people won't want to bring you down. I believe that Hesiod's story offers a true account of good leadership. There is a considerable difference here in your responses, right? Did you notice that 70 or 80% of you said that you thought that the story was not true? And then you say, but I do believe it offers a true account of good leadership. Euthyphro was right. This is an opinion question. Hesiod's story powerfully explains why a man might justly prosecute his father. Generally agree. That is, in the dialogue, Euthyphro tends to come across as wrong, but there's a sense in which there was sure something there in Hesiod. If you start at the very beginnings, Homer and Hesiod, what you find are some real smart political ideas, like the one we just talked about. As people looked back, they said, you know, we learnt our values from Homer and Hesiod, and to hold true to that, even when it was against our own interests, right? Do you really think that Zeus wanted to say, oh, let me give up some of my power? But by the time Euthyphro comes along, it's in a time when that kind of traditionalism is viewed as old-fashioned, like, yeah, Gramps used to talk that way. When was the last time you heard a major political speech that emphasized honor? So it just sounded old and silly. Now let's look at Socrates' skepticism. What are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger? Socrates reasons. People don't really get into wars about numbers and weights because those things can be measured. We actually have a yardstick, as it were, or a scales that we can resolve our dispute by measuring. Instead, the real disputes that people seem to lack a measure for are just and unjust, good and bad, beautiful and ugly. According to your argument, Socrates goes on, different gods consider different things to be just, beautiful, ugly, good, and bad. That's right, says Euthyphro. What does that imply about the gods? They are ignorant of what good and bad, just and unjust, beautiful and ugly are. When Socrates insists that he must obey God, he understands that the God he must obey may be wrong. Good. I'm glad most of you disagree, because his definition of God is what is really right. And he knows that he may get things wrong, but so far as when he thinks something's right, he's got to try, because ultimate right is ultimate right. Now, towards the height of Athenian prosperity, after 200 years of this traditional morality, the talk about you've got to do what Zeus says, Zeus enforces justice, Hesiodic morality. After a couple hundred years, this became kind of bumper stickerish. All these things always do, right? And so what happens is that at some point people have enough of this. And Protagoras came along and did this. He was one of the great thinkers of this period, and he just threw some elbows intellectually and cleared out some room for people to think freely. In his book on truth, he says, man is the measure of all things, of the things that are, that really are, that they really are, and of the things that are not, that they are not. The gods don't figure out, the universe doesn't figure out, we decide what's real. And both Euthyphro and Socrates disagree with these views. Socrates, here's how he argues, where Protagoras claims that man is the measure of what's real and what isn't. So if this view were to lose its last believer, he says, it wouldn't be true anymore, right? His truth wouldn't be true because nobody believed it. Well, that would have That would have meant some strange things for modern science, wouldn't it? There didn't used to be gravity, for instance, until Newton came along and invented it. What about contradictory truths? Even those that claim to be exclusively true, such as those that say, my view of truth is true and Protagoras' isn't. Well, those are just as true as Protagoras', since man is the measure, right? Ultimately, he says, Protagoras' claim is ironic in that it results in the conclusion not that man is the measure of all things, but rather that there is no measure of all things. And so ultimately you end up with no reality at all. But he's also very generous in the way he deals with Protagoras. He stipulates, I've just given these objections, but in a lot of areas, what Protagoras says is really smart. In many things, we really do have different experiences and different judgments. If we were to ask my daughter and my wife about, give them each a jalapeno and ask if it was hot, we would get very different responses. But he says, it just doesn't work in some areas. Which of us thinks that everybody is equally wise? I mean, if you want somebody to help you with your calculus homework, do you just randomly pick someone off the street and say, write down the answer here, I'm sure that you'll get it right. And it doesn't work in medical treatment, he says. If you're sick, you should know the truth about what's wrong with you and what to do about it, fix yourself. But it doesn't work that way. We have to find experts, and they tell us. See, so he says, in a lot of ways, it just doesn't hold up to inspection. And he says, what we really need in making judgments about what's good and bad and trying to solve these problems is principles that rise above specifics. We want to get above the situation, he says, of talking about your injustice towards me, my injustice towards you, and try to figure out what's really good. What is just? In God, there isn't any sort of wrong whatsoever. He is supremely just. That's what we mean. And the thing most like him is the man who has become as just as it is possible for human nature to be. By the way, you notice that was Zeus's goal. And then he goes on to say that it's really a terrible thing, not only for a community, but for an individual, not to care what's ultimately right. And the issue here, there's a penalty, he says, that comes to injustice. It isn't that somebody's going to come along and grab you and put you in jail or beat you or barbecue you. Instead, the real penalty is that if you become unjust, you're unjust. To Plato's mind, anybody who doesn't believe that just the way ordinary life in the city is ultimately good, anybody who refuses to accept the status quo as perfect, and instead says, no, there's something better that we should strive for, that's God. I want to be just, wise, and good even more than I want to be successful. You might take note of the fact that your fellow students are pretty good people with pretty good ideals, and sometimes we tend to forget that. There's something really weird about talking about it's my religion, and if you tread on it, you are really, because I'm trying to think of Jesus talking that way, but he didn't. There's the people who came up with this religion didn't talk about their religion. They talked about loving God and loving neighbor. And they didn't have any churches, and they didn't have any holy ground, and they thought that they should treat people right, and that they should take abuse rather than give it. That is to say, there's something really weird about a tradition transmogrifying into something that seems to be almost exactly the opposite of what it set out to be. And one useful thing that might happen when people find themselves at loggerheads, my religion this, my religion that, is to step back and say, well, how do I get to claim it as my religion? It isn't mine in the sense of, I have my keys and my wallet. If I want to go out and throw them in the river, I can. I'm not sure that religion's one of those things that can be mine in that sense.
It's like it's a direct disrespect of that person. somehow they take it as a slam against them personally.
In the same way as if somebody
Devalue.
kicked their dog.
Right.
You know.
Or insulted their mother or something like that.
It's another
It's almost not even about religion. It's almost about respecting me for who I am as a person different from you.
I'm important.